My dad skipped my wedding to fund my brother's failed business. But when my $580 million hotel chain hit the news, Dad texted, "Family dinner at 7 p.m. Important discussion." I showed up with the exact thing that would destroy his entire empire. I stood outside the heavy oak doors of the country club, my hand gripping the cold brass handle. For years, I was the son who wasn't allowed inside, the son who didn't measure up. But tonight, I wasn't here to ask for a seat at their table. I was here to take the table away. Before I tell you about the absolute disaster that happened when I opened that door, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. The air outside the Oak Ridge Country Club was crisp, carrying the scent of expensive cigars and old money. I stood there, a 32-year-old man, feeling the weight of a thick leather briefcase in my left hand. Inside that briefcase wasn't a peace offering. It wasn't a check to bail out my father's sinking ship. It was a mirror, and I was about to force him to look right into it. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the screen one more time. The text message was still there, sitting at the top of my notifications like a stain. Family dinner at 7 p.m. Important discussion. No, hello, Mason. No, congratulations on the massive success. No, I'm proud of you, son. Just a cold, sterile command. It was the first time I had heard from Charles. I stopped calling him Dad a long time ago. In over 3 years. He didn't text me when my first hotel opened. He didn't text me when I won the Regional Hospitality Award. He certainly didn't text me on my wedding day, except to tell me he couldn't be bothered to show up. But the very morning the Wall Street Journal published a front-page article about my company reaching a $580 million valuation, suddenly, I was summoned. I let out a slow, steady breath. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. That was the most surprising part of all this. For my entire life, the mere thought of confronting my father would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have agonized over what to wear, what to say, how to sit so I wouldn't offend him. But standing there under the warm amber glow of the porch lights, I felt nothing but a sharp, calculating calm. I looked through the glass pane of the door. I could see them sitting in the private dining room at the back. Charles at the head of the table, his posture rigid, demanding authority. My mother, Evelyn, sitting to his right, wearing her signature pearls and a tight, nervous smile. And my older brother, Carter, the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong, even as he systematically ruined everything he touched. They were drinking wine they couldn't afford, eating steaks paid for by credit lines that were about to snap. They thought I was coming to save them. They thought the invisible son, the one they cast aside, was going to eagerly hand over a massive check just to finally earn a scrap of their affection. They had no idea what was actually inside my briefcase. I adjusted my suit jacket, rolled my shoulders back, and pushed the door open. But to understand why this moment was so crucial, why I was willing to walk into that room and dismantle my own family, you have to know what happened on the day that finally broke me. It was a Tuesday in late October. The church was old, with massive stained glass windows that cast long, colorful shadows across the wooden pews. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I was marrying Olivia, the woman who had stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. But as I stood in the small vestibule at the back of the church, adjusting my tie for the 100th time, I felt like I was suffocating. I kept pulling my phone out of my pocket, staring at the blank screen. Every time the heavy wooden doors of the church creaked open, my head snapped up, hoping to see his familiar, imposing figure walk through. But it was just another guest, another friend of Olivia's, another distant relative. "He's going to come, Mason," Olivia's brother whispered, patting my shoulder. He was trying to be kind, but I could see the pity in his eyes. Everyone knew the dynamic in my family. "Yeah, traffic is probably just bad," I lied, slipping the phone back into my pocket. 10 minutes before the music was supposed to start, my phone vibrated. I yanked it out so fast I almost dropped it. It was a text from Charles. My chest tightened with a desperate kind of hope. I opened it. "Can't make it. Important meeting with investors for Carter's new launch. Send Olivia my regards." I just stood there, I read the words over and over again until the letters blurred together. No apology. No explanation. Just a casual dismissal. He was skipping his only other son's wedding to attend a meeting for Carter's third failed business attempt. Olivia found me there a few minutes later. She looked breathtaking in her white dress, but the moment she saw my face, her smile vanished. She didn't ask what happened. She just knew. She walked over, her heels clicking softly on the stone floor, and wrapped her arms around my neck. "He's not coming?" I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He actually chose a meeting over this." Olivia pulled back and looked me dead in the eyes. Her hands were warm against my cold cheeks. "Listen to me, Mason. You do not need him here to validate this day. You don't have to pretend you're okay with this. It hurts and it's unfair. But when those doors open, you are walking down that aisle toward our future, and we are leaving the past behind." I nodded, but a piece of me died in that vestibule. When the organ music started and I walked out to take my place at the altar, I looked out at the sea of faces. Olivia's family took up 3 entire rows. My side of the aisle had a few friends from college and a couple of coworkers. And right in the front row, exactly where my parents and brother were supposed to sit, were 3 empty chairs. Those empty chairs were the loudest things in the room. They screamed at me throughout the entire ceremony. When I said my vows, I meant every word to Olivia, but in the back of my mind, I realized something terrifying and liberating all at once. I was completely on my own. It felt like I was attending a funeral for a relationship that never existed. I realized then that no matter what I did, no matter how successful I became or how good of a man I tried to be, I would never be enough for Charles. Because the game was rigged from the start. Growing up in our house felt like participating in a bizarre psychological experiment where only one person was given the rules. Carter was 3 years older than me, and from the moment I could understand the concept of praise, I knew it belonged entirely to him. Carter was the high school quarterback, the guy with the loud laugh and the easy charm. Charles saw himself in Carter. He saw his own ambition, his own ruthlessness, his own loud presence. I was different. I liked reading, I liked architecture, I liked observing people. To Charles, quiet meant weak. I remember being 14 years old. I had spent 3 months building a complex architectural model for a state-level design competition. I had poured my heart into it, gluing tiny pieces of balsa wood until my fingers bled. I made it to the finals. The night before the exhibition, I went into Charles's home office. He was staring at his computer, nursing a glass of scotch. "Dad," I said quietly, "the exhibition is tomorrow at 6. They're announcing the winners. Will you come?" He didn't even look away from the screen. "Mason, Carter has a regional playoff game tomorrow night. Scouts from 2 universities are going to be there. I can't miss that." "But the game doesn't start until 8. I pleaded, my voice cracking. "The exhibition is only 20 minutes away. You could come for half an hour and still make kickoff." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes cold and irritated. "Do you not understand how important this is for your brother's future? Stop being so selfish, Mason. This family requires sacrifices. You should be grateful we have a winner under this roof." I walked back to my room, threw the architectural model in the trash, and never spoke of it again. My mother, Evelyn, was no better. She was the queen of passive-aggressive manipulation. Whenever Charles would verbally tear me down, she would wait until he left the room, then come over and stroke my hair. "You know your father loves you, Mason," she would coo. "He's just under so much pressure. You need to be the easy child. Don't cause trouble. Let Carter have his moment." Her entire existence was dedicated to smoothing over Charles's cruelty. It was a constant custody battle over my own self-worth, and my parents were determined to make sure I lost. The ultimate betrayal happened when I was 18. I had worked part-time jobs all through high school to save up for a specific business program at a private university. I had a dedicated college fund that my grandparents had set up for me. But when the tuition bill came, the account was empty. I confronted Charles in the kitchen. He didn't even blink. "Carter needed the money, Mason. His tech startup needed seed capital, and the banks wouldn't lend to an 18-year-old. It's an investment in the family. You can go to the community college. It builds character. He emptied my college fund to pay for Carter's mistakes. Carter's startup, predictably, went bankrupt 6 months later, and the money was gone forever. I moved out the next day. I packed 2 duffel bags, walked out the front door, and swore I would never ask them for a single dime or a single ounce of approval ever again. I didn't just leave my house. I left the entire timeline my father had scripted for me. With nothing but the cash I had saved from my part-time jobs, I moved to a neighboring state. I worked construction during the day and waited tables at night. Every single dollar I didn't need for cheap ramen and rent went into a savings account. By the time I was 24, I had saved enough for a small down payment on a commercial property. It wasn't glamorous. It was a dilapidated, past its prime motel sitting right off a secondary highway. The paint was peeling in sheets. The neon sign flickered ominously, and the carpets smelled faintly of mildew and despair. But when I looked at it, I didn't see a ruin. I saw a canvas. I needed a business loan to cover the renovations. I put on my only cheap suit and walked into the local bank. I sat across from Mr. Sterling, a loan officer with a patronizing smile and a watch that cost more than my car. He skimmed my business plan for exactly 30 seconds before sliding it back across the desk. Mr. Collins, this is a very enthusiastic proposal. But let's look at the facts. You have no collateral. You have no history in corporate hospitality. You're working 2 minimum wage jobs. What you need is a steady salary, not a pipe dream. The hospitality industry will chew you up and spit you out. I know the industry, I said, keeping my voice level. I know that people don't just want a bed. They want an experience. They want to feel seen. I can turn that property around in 12 months. Sterling chuckled, a dry, mocking sound. I appreciate your ambition, son. But ambition doesn't pay the mortgage. Application denied. Come back when you have a real job. I walked out of that bank with my ears burning. But I wasn't defeated. I was furious. His condescension sounded exactly like Charles. That anger became my fuel. I didn't go to another big bank. I went to a private lender, took on a loan with a brutal interest rate, and bought the motel anyway. I called it the Haven. I couldn't afford a construction crew, so I became one. I spent my days ripping up moldy carpets, painting walls, and fixing plumbing. My hands were permanently calloused, covered in blisters and cuts. I lived in room 12, eating canned beans and drafting marketing strategies on the back of old receipts. It was exhausting, bone-deep labor. There were days when my back ached so badly I could barely stand up, and my bank account was so close to zero I felt a constant knot of panic in my stomach. But every time I hammered a nail or hung a new fixture, I felt a strange sense of ownership. No one handed this to me. Carter got a promotion at Dad's company just for breathing. I was building my life with my bare hands. I was terrified, yes, but for the first time in my life I was completely free. The real test didn't come from the banks or the renovations. It came during our first winter of operation. We had been open for 3 months. We were at 70% capacity, mostly cross-country travelers and truckers. I was finally starting to breathe a little easier. Then, in early January, a massive blizzard hit the region. It was a freak storm, dropping 2 feet of snow in a matter of hours. The wind howled like a freight train, rattling the old windows of the motel. Around 8 p.m., the power grid failed. The entire property plunged into pitch-black darkness. The heating system, which I had patched together with spare parts and prayer, completely shut down. The temperature inside the rooms started dropping rapidly. I grabbed a flashlight and ran to the front desk. The phone was already ringing off the hook with panicked guests. I knew that if I didn't handle this perfectly, the negative reviews would destroy my business before it even got off the ground. I spent the next 6 hours running through the freezing, pitch-black corridors. I handed out every spare blanket we had. I brought thermoses of hot water, heated on a small camping stove, to families with young kids. I knocked on every single door, checking on people, apologizing, and reassuring them that I was doing everything I could. My lips were blue, and I couldn't feel my toes. Around 2 a.m., I finally retreated to the basement boiler room to try and manually restart the backup generator. It was freezing down there, smelling of dust and old oil. I cranked the heavy metal handle of the generator over and over, my muscles screaming in protest, but the engine just coughed and died. I fell back against the concrete wall and slid to the floor. The flashlight beam flickered, casting long, lonely shadows across the pipes. The cold seeped through my jacket, chilling me to the bone. In that dark, freezing basement, the weight of everything crashed down on me. The debt, the exhaustion, the terrifying reality that I was completely alone. If this failed, I had no safety net. There was no father to write a check, no mother to comfort me. I pulled my knees to my chest, buried my face in my freezing hands, and for the first and only time since I left home, I broke down. I sobbed in the dark, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. I cried for the unfairness of it all. I cried for the boy who just wanted his dad to watch his science fair. I cried because I was so incredibly tired. But I only let myself cry for 5 minutes. I wiped my face with the back of my dirty sleeve. I took a deep, freezing breath. I stood up, grabbed the heavy wrench, and turned back to the generator. I tightened the fuel line, adjusted the choke, and pulled the cord with every ounce of strength I had left. With a loud, sputtering roar, the generator roared to life. A few seconds later, the dim emergency lights in the basement flickered on. I walked back upstairs. The heat was slowly coming back. A few guests peeked out of their doors, giving me tired, grateful smiles. That night in the boiler room changed me. It burned away the last remnants of the frightened kid hoping for rescue. I realized that night that I was my own rescue. I didn't need Charles Collins. I didn't need anyone. I was going to build an empire, and I was going to do it my way. 5 years passed. The Haven didn't just survive the winter. It thrived. People didn't just review the clean rooms. They reviewed how I treated them. They wrote about the owner who personally brought them coffee when their car broke down, the guy who remembered their names when they stayed a second time. That empathy, the exact thing my father viewed as a weakness, became my greatest business asset. I paid off the predatory loan in 2 years. I used the profits to buy a second property, a failing lodge up in the mountains. I rebranded it, focusing on eco-sustainability and minimalist luxury. Then came a third property by the coast. I wasn't just running motels anymore. I was building a brand. I named the company Aura Hospitality. My team grew. I hired Julian as my chief financial officer. Julian was brilliant, sharp, and fiercely loyal. He had been fired from a massive corporate firm for refusing to cover up a superior's accounting mistake. We understood each other perfectly. Together, we scaled the business aggressively but carefully. We created spaces that felt like sanctuaries. During those 5 years, my personal life blossomed. Olivia and I bought a house. We built a life filled with actual warmth. But the silence from my family was absolute. It was a strange, haunting kind of quiet. I didn't block their numbers. A part of me, some pathetic, lingering inner child, still expected a text on my birthday or a card at Christmas. But there was nothing. When my second hotel was featured in a national travel magazine, I bought a copy and left it on my kitchen counter for a week, staring at it, wondering if Charles had seen it. I found out through a mutual acquaintance that my uncle had passed away. I wasn't invited to the funeral. I saw photos on Facebook of Carter standing next to Charles by the graveside, looking solemn and important in his tailored suit. Stung, but the sting was getting duller. They were erasing me from the narrative, and honestly, I was letting them. I was too busy building my own world to care about the one I was banned from. By year 7, Aura Hospitality wasn't just a regional success. It was disrupting the industry. We had investors knocking on our doors, wanting a piece of the pie. We were acquiring boutique properties across the country, turning them into high-profit, high-empathy retreats. I was working a 70-hour week, flying across states, negotiating massive contracts. My salary jumped from minimum wage survival to numbers I never thought I'd see in my bank account. But I never bought a flashy car. I never bought expensive watches. I poured every cent back into the business, into my employees, into the vision. I was building a fortress, brick by brick, ensuring that no one could ever make me feel small or helpless again. I was untouchable, or so I thought, until the day the valuation hit. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly the kind of crisp, clear day that makes you feel like anything is possible. I was standing in the boardroom of our new corporate headquarters, a sleek, glass-walled office in downtown Seattle. The view of the skyline was breathtaking, a far cry from the moldy boiler room of the Haven. Julian was pacing the floor, a tablet gripped tightly in his hands. Elijah, our lead investor and one of the most ruthless venture capitalists on the West Coast, was sitting at the head of the conference table sipping espresso. Elijah was a man who only cared about numbers, but he had believed in my vision when the traditional banks laughed at me. "We got the final audit back," Julian said, stopping his pacing. He looked up at me, his eyes wide behind his glasses. He swallowed hard. "Mason, just say it, Julian," I replied, crossing my arms to hide the sudden flutter of nerves in my stomach. Elijah set his espresso cup down. The clink of the porcelain echoed in the quiet room. "The numbers are solid, Mason. The acquisitions from last quarter pushed the margins higher than our most aggressive projections." Julian looked down at his tablet, then back at me, a massive grin spreading across his face. "The official valuation of Aura Hospitality, as of this morning, is $580 million. The room went completely silent. I felt the air leave my lungs. 580 million. It wasn't just a number. It was validation. It was armor. It was the ultimate proof that Mr. Sterling at the bank was wrong, that Charles was wrong, that every person who told me I was too soft for business was dead wrong. "Congratulations, son," Elijah said, standing up and extending his hand. "You built a monster." I shook his hand, my grip firm, but my mind was spinning. Within an hour, the news broke. The financial press loves a rags-to-riches story. "The Millennial Maverick Revolutionizing Hospitality," one headline read. "From a single rundown motel to a $580 million empire," read another. My phone started vibrating and didn't stop. Emails, texts, LinkedIn notifications poured in like a flood. Industry leaders who had ignored my emails a year ago were suddenly sending me gift baskets. I walked out of the boardroom, retreating to my private office. I locked the door, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, and pressed my forehead against the cool glass. I looked down at the city, the tiny cars moving like ants below. I should have felt euphoric. I should have been jumping around the room, popping champagne. But instead, a profound, heavy stillness settled over me. I had reached the pinnacle. I had won the game. But as I stared at my reflection in the glass, the only thought that echoed in my mind was, "Does he know?" I hated myself for thinking it. After everything, after 7 years of silence, after building a mountain of success with my own hands, my brain still defaulted to wondering if my father was finally impressed. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push the thought away. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A single, sharp vibration. I pulled the phone out, expecting another congratulatory text from a vendor or an ecstatic message from Olivia. Instead, a name I hadn't seen on my screen in over 1,000 days stared back at me. My heart slammed against my ribs. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My thumb hovered over the screen. For a second, a pathetic, buried part of me hoped against hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe the $580 million valuation had finally cracked his pride. Maybe he was writing to say he saw the article, that he was wrong, that he was proud. I tapped the message to open it. Family dinner at 7 p.m. Oak Ridge Country Club. Important discussion. I read it 3 times. The words felt like physical blows. There was no congratulations. There was no acknowledgement of the massive milestone I had just achieved. There wasn't even my name. It was a summons. A directive from a CEO to a subordinate. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. He ignored my wedding. He ignored my struggles. He ignored my existence. But the absolute second I became half a billionaire on paper, he expected me to snap to attention and report for duty. I marched out of my office and straight down the hall to Julian's desk. I threw my phone down on top of his financial spreadsheets. "Read that," I demanded, my voice dangerously low. Julian frowned, picked up the phone, and read the screen. He let out a low whistle, sliding the phone back to me. "Wow, timing is impeccable. What's the important discussion?" "He wants money," I said, leaning over the desk. "It's the only language he speaks. The timing isn't a coincidence, Julian. He saw the headlines. He knows I have capital. He wants me to fund whatever disaster Carter has cooked up this time, or bail out one of his own failing projects." "So ignore it," Julian said simply, taking a sip of his water. "Block the number. You don't owe him anything, Mason. You've proven your point." I picked up my phone, staring at the screen. Julian was right. The logical, healthy thing to do was to delete the text and go home to my wife to celebrate. But logic wasn't driving me right now. A dark, furious curiosity was bubbling up inside my chest. "No," I said quietly, a cold realization washing over me. "If I ignore it, he'll just think I'm still the frightened kid hiding from him. He'll think he still has power over me." Julian looked up, his brow furrowed. "Mason, don't do this. Don't walk into a trap." "It's not a trap if you own the cage, Julian," I replied, the anger crystallizing into a razor-sharp focus. "I'm going to this dinner, but I'm not going to sit there and listen to his demands. I need to know exactly what his angle is. I need you to run a deep dive into Charles Collins's financials. Everything. Corporate holdings, private equity, personal debt, mortgage lines. I want to know what he had for breakfast this morning." Julian sighed, opening a new window on his monitors. "You're opening Pandora's box, boss. Open it," I commanded, "and tell me exactly how deep the rot goes." It only took Julian 4 hours to unravel a lie that Charles had spent a decade maintaining. I was pacing my office, drinking my 4th cup of coffee, when Julian walked in, closing the heavy glass door securely behind him. He didn't have his tablet this time. He had a thick stack of printed documents. He dropped them on my desk with a heavy thud. He looked pale. "You're not going to believe this," Julian said, pulling up a chair and gesturing for me to sit. I dropped into my leather chair. "Give it to me straight. Your father's empire isn't just struggling, Mason," Julian began, his voice grim. "It's a smoking crater. He's effectively bankrupt." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the words. "Bankrupt? That's impossible. Collins Real Estate owns half the commercial district. He has a massive portfolio." "He had a massive portfolio," Julian corrected, tapping the top page of the stack. "On paper, the assets look great, but they are leveraged to the hilt. He's taken out secondary and tertiary loans against properties that are already underwater. But that's not the twist." Julian leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "The twist is why he's underwater. It wasn't just bad market investments. He was bleeding from the inside. Your Uncle Aaron." "Aaron?" I repeated, stunned. "His brother? The former CFO of his company?" "Exactly," Julian nodded. "Aaron didn't just retire to Florida 2 years ago. According to the SEC filings and the quiet legal settlements I managed to dig up, Aaron embezzled close to $40 million over 5 years. He funneled it through shell companies disguised as vendor payments." I felt the room spin slightly. Uncle Aaron, the man who sat at our Thanksgiving table, laughing and drinking Charles's expensive wine. "Why didn't Charles press charges?" I asked, completely bewildered. "Charles would destroy anyone who stole a dime from him. Because going public with the embezzlement would have triggered a clause in his massive commercial loans," Julian explained, flipping to a highlighted page. "If the lenders knew his internal financials were compromised, they would have called in the debts immediately. Charles chose his pride and his reputation over survival. He covered it up. He let Aaron walk away with a slap on the wrist to keep the story out of the press. and he's been desperately shifting money between accounts ever since to cover the interest payments. Julian paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room. The music has stopped, Mason. 3 major banks are about to issue notices of default by the end of the week. They're going to foreclose on his entire portfolio. He summoned you to dinner tonight because you are his absolute last resort. He expects you to write a massive check to save his legacy. I sat back in my chair, staring at the stack of papers. The sheer hypocrisy of it made me sick. He cast me out for being weak, for not being ruthless enough. Yet here he was, ruined by his own blind arrogance, covering up a family betrayal just to protect his precious ego. He was drowning, and he demanded I be his life raft. A slow, terrifying idea began to form in the back of my mind. I looked at the documents, then at Julian. "Julian," I said slowly, the gears in my head turning with dangerous precision. "Who holds the majority of these impending defaulted loans?" Julian blinked, surprised by the shift in my tone. "A consortium led by Meridian Pacific Bank." "Why? Meridian Pacific?" I repeated. "They're panicking, right? They're about to have hundreds of millions in toxic real estate debt dropped on their balance sheets before the end of the fiscal quarter." Julian's eyes widened. He realized exactly what I was thinking. "Mason, no. You're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting." I stood up, grabbing my suit jacket. "Call Gabriel. Tell him to get his legal team ready. We have a meeting with Meridian Pacific in an hour." Gabriel, my lead corporate lawyer, looked like he was about to have a heart attack. We were sitting in a private conference room at Meridian Pacific Bank. Across the table sat 3 very sweaty, very stressed banking executives. "You want to buy the entire debt portfolio of Collins Real Estate?" the lead banker asked, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Mr. Collins, Mason, you understand the sheer toxicity of these assets? They are hemorrhaging cash. The foreclosure process alone will take years of litigation." "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table. "Which is why I'm offering to buy the debt at a 50% discount. Cash transfer. I take the toxic assets off your books before your quarterly earnings call, and you get to sleep at night." Gabriel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mason, as your attorney, I have to advise you that mixing personal vengeance with a corporate acquisition of this scale is highly irregular." "It's not vengeance, Gabriel," I replied smoothly, never breaking eye contact with the bankers. "It's a hostile takeover of distressed assets. The land beneath his failing properties is prime real estate for our new wellness retreat line. The buildings are garbage, but the locations are gold. It's a solid business move." It was a lie, of course. Well, half a lie. The business case was shaky at best, but the personal case was rock solid. I wasn't just buying buildings. I was buying control. I was buying the narrative. The bankers whispered frantically among themselves. They were backed into a corner, terrified of explaining a massive default to their shareholders. After 10 agonizing minutes, the lead banker sighed heavily and nodded. "We'll draft the assignment of debt agreements. We can execute the transfer by 6 p.m. For the next 4 hours, the room was a blur of high-speed legal wrangling. Stacks of contracts were printed, reviewed, redlined, and reprinted. I drank bitter black coffee, my hand cramping as I signed my name on line after line. Every signature transferred a piece of my father's empire into my hands. His office building, his luxury apartment complexes, the very house I grew up in, which he had secretly leveraged against a commercial loan. By 6:15 p.m., the ink was dry. The wire transfer from Aura Hospitality's acquisition fund was confirmed. I stood up, shaking hands with the bankers. I felt a strange vibration humming through my veins. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was an overwhelming sense of absolute power. Charles Collins had spent his entire life building a kingdom on the premise of his own superiority. In the span of an afternoon, I had quietly bought the ground beneath his throne. As we walked out of the bank and into the fading evening light, Gabriel let out a long breath. You are officially the sole primary creditor for every asset your father owns. If he misses a single payment, which he will because he has no cash, you have the legal right to seize everything. I know, I said, looking at my watch. It was 6:30 p.m. Gabriel looked at me, a hint of fear in his eyes. What are you going to do, Mason? I have a family dinner to attend, I said, opening the door to my waiting car. And a very important discussion. Before heading to the country club, I stopped back at the office to pick up the physical dossier of the debt transfer. Julian was waiting for me in my office, looking like he had seen a ghost. The transfer went through, I said, grabbing my leather briefcase. Print the final summaries for me. I'm printing them now, Julian said, his voice tight. But Mason, while you were at the bank, I kept digging into the internal communications files we gained access to during due diligence. You need to see this. He handed me a single sheet of paper. It was a printed email chain. I scanned the text. It was from Carter's private email address to a man named Luke Vance. Luke was my father's biggest rival in the local commercial real estate market. They hated each other with a passion that bordered on pathological. What is this? I asked, my eyes flying over the paragraphs. Read the dates, Julian urged. This started 3 weeks ago. I read the email. Carter, the golden boy, the loyal son, was actively negotiating with Luke Vance. Carter was offering to secretly hand over the proprietary lease agreements and tenant financial records of Charles's most valuable remaining properties. In exchange, Luke would guarantee Carter a high-level executive promotion at his firm, complete with a massive signing bonus, once Charles went bankrupt. My blood turned to ice. Carter was selling our father out. He's orchestrating a fire sale, Julian explained softly. Carter knows the ship is sinking. Instead of helping Charles bail water, he's stealing the lifeboats and selling the coordinates to the enemy. He's securing his own fake promotion and jumping ship. I gripped the edge of my desk. The sheer, ugly truth of my family was laid bare on that piece of paper. Charles was a tyrant who covered up a felony to save his pride. Evelyn was an enabler who turned a blind eye. And Carter, the son who got my college fund, the son who was praised and protected, was a traitor who was twisting the knife into his own father's back just to maintain his luxury lifestyle. This was the family that had made me feel inadequate for 30 years. This was the family that made me feel like I was the broken one. I carefully folded the email chain and slid it into the heavy leather briefcase, right next to the debt ownership documents. You're walking into a slaughterhouse, Mason, Julian said quietly. No, I replied, snapping the brass clasps of the briefcase shut. The sound echoed in the quiet office. I'm walking into an exorcism. I walked to the elevator, rode it down to the lobby, and stepped out into the night. The drive to the Oak Ridge Country Club was a blur. My mind was perfectly clear, razor-sharp, and cold. I pulled into the parking lot, past the rows of luxury cars, and killed the engine. I grabbed the briefcase. I walked up the stone steps. I stood before the heavy oak doors, just like I described at the very beginning of this story. I was no longer the discarded son. I was the executioner, and it was time for dinner. The heavy oak doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club's private dining room felt cold under my hand. For a split second, the ghost of the 14-year-old boy I used to be hesitated. That boy was terrified of the man sitting on the other side. But I wasn't that boy anymore. I pushed the doors open. The room was bathed in a warm, amber light from a crystal chandelier. It smelled of roasted lamb, aged Cabernet, and the unmistakable scent of desperation masked by expensive cologne. Matthew, the club's longtime manager, was quietly pouring water at a side station. And there they were, the holy trinity of my misery. Charles sat at the head of the table, exactly where he always positioned himself, the king holding court. He looked older, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by stress, but his posture was as rigid and arrogant as ever. My mother, Evelyn, sat to his right, wearing her pearls and a forced, trembling smile. To his left slouched Carter, the golden boy, He was wearing a custom-tailored suit, swirling a glass of red wine with an expression of profound boredom. They all looked up as I walked in. The silence in the room was so thick you could choke on it. "You're late," Charles said. Not hello. Not how are you. Not a single word about the fact that my face was plastered across the financial news that morning with a $580 million valuation. Just a reprimand. A reflex to put me in my place. I closed the door behind me. I didn't apologize. I didn't rush to take the empty seat at the far end of the table. I just stood there, gripping my leather briefcase, looking at the man who had skipped my wedding for a business meeting. "Take a seat, Mason," Evelyn cooed, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary sweetness she always used when she wanted something. "We ordered the lamb. Your favorite." "I hate lamb, Evelyn," I said flatly. "Carter likes lamb. I'm allergic to it. I have been since I was 10. Evelyn's smile faltered, her hand fluttering nervously to her pearl necklace. Carter rolled his eyes and took a loud sip of his wine. "Sit down and stop being dramatic," Charles ordered, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "We don't have time for your usual sensitivity. We have an important family matter to discuss." I walked slowly toward the table, but I didn't sit. I placed my heavy leather briefcase right in the center of the crisp white tablecloth, right next to the silver bread basket. "Let's skip the appetizers, Charles," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I know why I'm here. You read the Wall Street Journal this morning. You saw my valuation. And now, after 3 years of absolute silence, you suddenly remember you have a second son." Charles's jaw tightened. A vein pulsed visibly at his temple. "You should watch your tone. I am your father. You are a part of this family, and right now this family's legacy is under attack. The market has been hostile. The banks are being unreasonable. We need a temporary capital injection to stabilize the properties and protect your future inheritance." I actually laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was sharp and cold. "My inheritance?" I asked, leaning slightly over the table. "You mean the empire that is currently defaulting on 3 major commercial loans? The empire that was bled dry by Uncle Aaron's embezzlement? The embezzlement you illegally covered up to protect your own ego?" The color drained completely out of Charles's face. He looked like I had just struck him with a baseball bat. Evelyn gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Carter slammed his wine glass down, spilling dark red liquid across the white tablecloth. "How do you know about that?" Charles hissed, his voice dropping to a furious whisper. He glanced nervously at Matthew the manager, who had frozen in the corner. "I know everything," I said. "You came here to gloat?" Carter sneered, standing up and pointing a finger at me. "You got lucky with a few cheap motels, Mason. Dad built a real estate dynasty. He just needs a bridge loan. If you're not going to write the check, get out." "I'm not going to write you a check, Carter," I said softly. I popped the brass clasps on my briefcase. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents I had just signed at Meridian Pacific Bank. I dropped them onto the table. They landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right in front of Charles. "What is this?" Charles demanded, staring at the papers as if they were radioactive. "I didn't come here to give you a loan," I stated, locking eyes with my father. "I came to inform you of a change in management. Meridian Pacific was terrified of your toxic debt. They were going to foreclose on you by Friday. So I bought it, all of it, at a 50% discount." Charles blinked. His brain, usually so sharp and calculating, was short-circuiting. You bought my debt?" "I own your mortgages, Charles," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "I own the liens on your commercial properties. I own the paper on the house you live in. I am your sole primary creditor. You don't owe the bank anymore. You owe me." For 10 seconds, the room was absolutely silent. The only sound was the distant clinking of silverware from the main dining room down the hall. Then Charles exploded. He slammed both fists onto the table, rattling the plates and knocking over his water glass. He stood up, towering over the table, his face flushed dark red with pure, unfiltered rage. "You stole from me," he roared, spit flying from his lips. "You went behind my back and stole my company. I built this family. I built this name. You arrogant, ungrateful little punk. You are no son of mine." The words hit me. You are no son of mine. A decade ago, that sentence would have destroyed me. It would have sent me to my knees, begging for forgiveness. But tonight, it felt like someone had just unlocked my handcuffs. "You're right," I said, my voice perfectly steady over his screaming. "I'm not your son. I stopped being your son the day you emptied my college fund to pay for Carter's mistakes. I stopped being your son the day you let me stand at the altar alone. You made sure I was never your son. But I am your landlord." Evelyn burst into loud, theatrical tears. "Mason, please, stop this. He's your father. Carter, say something to your brother." I turned my gaze to Carter. My older brother was staring at the debt documents, his face pale, his usual arrogance completely stripped away. He looked terrified. "Yes, Carter," I said, reaching into my briefcase one last time. "Say something. Why don't you tell Dad about your meeting with Luke Vance last week?" At the mention of Luke Vance's name, Charles stopped yelling. He froze, turning his head slowly to look at his golden boy. Luke Vance was Charles's sworn enemy, a rival developer who had been trying to crush Collins' real estate for 20 years. "What is he talking about, Carter?" Charles demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Carter swallowed hard, taking a step back from the table. "Dad, it's a lie. Mason is just trying to cause trouble." I pulled the printed email chain out of my briefcase and slid it across the table toward Charles. "That is a written agreement," I said clearly so everyone in the room could hear. "Carter agreed to hand over your proprietary tenant financial records to Luke Vance. In exchange, Luke promised Carter a massive signing bonus and an executive promotion at his firm once you went bankrupt. Your golden boy wasn't trying to save your legacy, Charles. He was selling your carcass to your worst enemy to save his own skin." Charles picked up the paper with shaking hands. He read the emails. I watched a man's entire worldview shatter in real time. He looked at Carter. The betrayal in his eyes was absolute. All the years of praising Carter, funding his failures, prioritizing him over me, it all came down to this piece of paper. "You sold me out?" Charles whispered, his voice cracking. "Dad, you were going under." Carter yelled defensively, finally dropping the act. "The money was gone. Uncle Aaron took it, and you were sinking us all. I had to look out for myself. I deserve a salary that matches my lifestyle." "Get out," Charles breathed, leaning heavily against the table as if all the strength had left his legs. "Dad, listen to me. Get out of my sight," Charles screamed, throwing his wine glass at the wall behind Carter. It shattered, raining glass onto the carpet. Carter didn't say another word. He turned and practically ran out of the dining room, slamming the heavy oak doors behind him. The room fell into a horrifying, broken silence. Evelyn was sobbing openly into her napkin. Charles stood there, staring at the shattered glass on the floor, a broken king in a ruined castle. I looked at them. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would feel a rush of vindictive joy. But I didn't. I just felt tired. Looking at Charles, I finally saw him not as the terrifying giant of my childhood, but as a small, pathetic man who valued pride over love, and who had lost everything because of it. I zipped up my empty briefcase. "You have 30 days, I said quietly. Charles didn't look up. 30 days for what? 30 days to vacate the corporate offices and your residential properties, I replied. After that, my company takes full operational control. We're liquidating the portfolio and tearing down the flagship buildings to build eco-retreats. The Collins real estate name is dead. I turned my back on them and walked toward the door. "Mason!" Evelyn cried out, standing up. "You can't do this to us. Where will we go?" I paused with my hand on the brass handle. I looked over my shoulder at the woman who had spent 30 years telling me to shrink myself so my father could feel big. "I'm sure Carter has a spare room," I said. I pushed the doors open and walked out. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The night air hit me like a physical wave the second I stepped out of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was cold, crisp, and completely clean. I stood on the top step for a moment, closing my eyes and pulling the oxygen deep into my lungs. For the first time in 32 years, my chest didn't ache. The chronic, invisible weight I had been carrying, the desperate need for my father's approval, the fear of his rejection, the suffocating rules of a family that never truly wanted me. It was gone. Left behind in that dining room with the shattered wine glass and the unpaid bills. I walked down the stone steps toward the parking lot. My car was idling in the shadows near the back. As I approached, the passenger door pushed open. Olivia stepped out. She was wearing a thick wool coat, her breath pluming in the cold air. I had told her not to come. I told her I needed to do this alone. But of course, she didn't listen. She was the only person in the world who truly understood the war I was fighting. She walked up to me and looked at my face. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask if I yelled, or if Charles apologized, or how much money it cost. She just reached out, wrapped her cold hands around my neck, and pulled me into a fierce, tight hug. "You're shaking," she whispered against my shoulder. "I know," I breathed, wrapping my arms around her waist, holding onto her like she was the only real thing in the world. "It's over, Liv. It's really over. I'm so proud of you," she said, pulling back to look into my eyes. "Not for the business, not for the money, for walking out of there." We got into the car. I didn't turn the radio on. I just drove us home through the quiet, winding streets of the city. I felt like I had just completed a marathon, a life sentence that I didn't realize I was serving. When we pulled into our driveway, the house was dark and quiet. Safe. I locked the front door behind us, and for the first time in my life, I knew the monsters couldn't follow me inside. The next morning, the sun flooded through the massive windows of my kitchen. I was standing at the counter, grinding coffee beans, the simple, rhythmic sound grounding me in reality. At exactly 9 a.m., my phone rang. It was Gabriel, my lawyer. "Good morning, Mason," Gabriel said, sounding wide awake and highly caffeinated. "I just received the final confirmations from the county clerk and the title companies. The debt assignment is fully recorded and legally binding in all jurisdictions. Charles Collins has zero legal recourse. You hold the master keys to the entire kingdom." "Thank you, Gabriel," I said, pouring hot water over the coffee grounds. "Send the formal 30-day eviction notices by certified mail today to all commercial and residential properties tied to the defaulted loans." "Already done," Gabriel confirmed. "And Mason, I heard through the grapevine this morning that Carter was escorted out of his office by security. Apparently, Luke Vance rescinded his job offer the moment he found out Carter didn't have the financial records to trade. Your brother is officially unemployed and locked out of his own industry." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I didn't feel bad for Carter. I didn't feel happy either. It was just the natural consequence of a lifetime of entitlement crashing into a brick wall of reality. "Understood," I said. "Let Julian know we begin property inspections next week." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the garden Olivia had planted last spring. The boogeyman was dead. The empire of Charles Collins, built on intimidation, ego, and lies, had collapsed under its own weight. I had expected the victory to feel loud, like fireworks. Instead, it felt like a quiet, empty room where a loud alarm had finally been turned off. I had absolute power over the people who hurt me, and my first instinct wasn't to punish them further. My first instinct was to completely ignore them and get back to work. A month later, the 30-day deadline expired. Charles and Evelyn vacated their sprawling estate in the middle of the night to avoid the neighbors seeing the moving trucks. I didn't ask where they went, and I instructed Julian not to tell me. I stood in the grand lobby of what used to be the Collins Plaza, my father's crown jewel. It was a gaudy, outdated monument to 1980s excess, black marble floors, gold-plated fixtures, and massive crystal chandeliers. Felt cold and hostile. David, my lead architect, was standing next to me, holding a massive roll of blueprints. David was a genius at taking broken things and making them breathe again. "It's a lot of square footage, Mason," David said, gesturing to the cavernous ceiling. "The bones are structurally sound, but the aesthetic is aggressive." "Tear it all out," I said, running a hand along a cold marble pillar. "All the gold, all the black stone. I want natural wood. I want massive skylights. I want living walls covered in greenery. When people walk into this building, I don't want them to feel intimidated by wealth. I want them to feel like they can finally exhale. Make it a sanctuary." David grinned, unrolling the blueprints. "I can work with that. We're going to have to gut the executive suites completely." "Do it," I said. "Start with my father's old office on the top floor. Demolish the walls. Turn it into a communal meditation space." Watching the demolition crews take sledgehammers to the marble floors of my father's empire was strangely therapeutic. It wasn't destruction. It was an excavation. We were clearing away the toxic history to build something rooted in peace. My business was hospitality, but the true business was healing. 2 weeks into the renovations, I was sitting in my corporate office reviewing supply chain contracts when my private cell phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I answered it. "Mason Collins." "Mason, honey? It's Mom." I froze. Her voice was trembling, thick with tears. All my instincts screamed at me to hang up the phone. But a tiny, foolish part of me, the part that still remembered her stroking my hair when I was a kid, stayed on the line. "What do you want, Evelyn?" I asked cautiously. "I left him, Mason," she sobbed into the receiver. "I packed my bags and I left your father. I'm staying at a cheap motel out by the interstate. It's awful here. I'm filing for a divorce." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "A divorce? After 35 years? I had to," she cried, her voice rising in pitch. "He's lost his mind, Mason. He just sits in a rented apartment, yelling at the walls, blaming everyone else. And Carter won't even return my calls. They are terrible men. But I always knew you were the good one. I always told your father you were special." My stomach turned. The sheer revisionist history was nauseating. "You never defended me, Evelyn," I said, my voice cold. "You used me as a shock absorber for his anger. You told me to stay quiet so you could keep your comfortable life." "I was a victim too," she wailed, playing her favorite card. "He controlled the money. I had no choice. But now I'm free. Mason, you're so successful now. You have all those hotels. I just need a small house. Nothing crazy, maybe 4 bedrooms in the suburbs. And a monthly stipend just until the divorce lawyer sorts out the alimony. You can afford it, honey. You can save your mother." I closed my eyes. It hit me then with perfect, terrifying clarity. Charles was a tyrant, yes, but Evelyn was a parasite. She didn't leave Charles because of his cruelty. She tolerated his cruelty for decades. She only left him because the money ran out. She was jumping from a sinking ship and trying to latch onto the nearest yacht. She wanted custody of a luxury lifestyle, and she expected me to foot the bill. "Listen to me very carefully, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am not your safety net. I am not the retirement plan you fall back on when your golden boy fails and your husband goes broke. You stood by and watched them destroy my college fund. You watched him abandon me at the altar. You chose your side a long time ago. Mason, please. You're my son." "No," I replied firmly. "I'm the guy who owns the bank. and your application is denied. I hung up the phone. I opened my settings, blocked the number, and dropped the phone onto my desk. I sat there for a long time, waiting for the guilt to hit me, waiting to feel like a terrible son who abandoned his mother in a cheap motel. But the guilt never came, only a profound, permanent silence. The last string tying me to that family had just been cut. I was completely unmoored, and I had never felt lighter. 18 months later, Aura Hospitality hosted the grand opening of our new flagship wellness retreat in the heart of the city, right on the exact footprint of the old Collins Plaza. It was a masterpiece. The oppressive marble was gone, replaced by warm cedar, flowing water features, and floor-to-ceiling glass that let the natural sunlight pour in. It didn't look like a corporate hotel. It looked like a place where you could go to repair a broken soul. The lobby was packed with investors, city officials, and travel journalists. Julian was holding court near the organic juice bar, looking sharp in a tailored suit, laughing with Elijah, our lead investor. I stood on the second-floor balcony, looking down at the crowd. I held a glass of sparkling water, listening to the soft, acoustic guitar music playing over the sound system. Olivia walked up beside me, slipping her arm through mine. She looked radiant. "They love it," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "The reviews are already pouring in. They're calling it the most innovative hospitality concept of the decade." "It's just a building, Liv." I smiled, kissing the top of her head. "It's not just a building," she corrected softly. "It's proof." She was right. It was proof that you don't have to inherit your father's cruelty to inherit the world. I had built an empire without sacrificing my empathy. I occasionally heard rumors about them through the industry grapevine. Carter was working middle management at a logistics company in another state, telling anyone who would listen about how he used to be a real estate mogul. Charles and Evelyn's divorce was messy and public, two bitter people fighting over the scraps of a ruined legacy. But they were just ghosts now. Stories that happened to a different person in a different lifetime. They had no power here. They had no seat at my table. Later that evening, long after the guests had gone home and the retreat was quiet, Olivia and I walked out to the massive rooftop garden. The city skyline stretched out before us, a sea of glittering lights against the dark night sky. I leaned against the glass railing, feeling the cool wind on my face. People assume that hitting a massive financial milestone like a $580 million valuation is a magic wand. They think that once your bank account has enough zeros, all the childhood trauma, all the rejection, all the feelings of inadequacy just magically disappear. But money doesn't heal you. Buying my father's debt didn't heal me. Watching him lose his mind at that dinner table was satisfying for about 10 seconds, but it didn't fix the hole inside me. What healed me was the realization that I had spent my entire life trying to win a game I was never allowed to play. I thought my father's approval was the ultimate prize. I thought if I just worked harder, built bigger, became wealthier, he would finally look at me and say the words I desperately wanted to hear. But love that requires a resume is not love. A family that demands you shrink yourself to fit their narrative is not a family. It's a cult of personality. I didn't lose my family when I walked out of that dining room. I lost my captors. I reclaimed my life. I chose myself. I looked at Olivia, the woman who held my hand when the church was empty, the woman who believed in me when I was sleeping in a freezing boiler room. She was my family. Julian, who had my back against a massive corporate lie, was my family. We get to choose who sits at our table. And my table is finally full of people who actually want to be there. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It's not an easy thing to talk about, but I know there are so many of you out there fighting silent battles against the people who were supposed to protect you. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, where you had to walk away from toxic family members to save yourself? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. Before you go, I have a special request. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you are part of an exclusive group. You are part of what I call the 1% Club. I want you to go down to the comments right now and type the letter W. That stands for winner. That is our secret code to recognize the people who have the patience, the depth, and the resilience to stick around until the very end. If my story helped you, please hit that like button and make sure you follow the channel so we can keep growing together. You are stronger than your past, and your future is entirely yours to build. See you in the next one.